In terms of how Congress actually functions, let me make some general points, and then I'm going to illustrate these by beginning to talk a little bit more specifically about the Senate and how it operates. I've found over the years that it's just easier to describe the work of the Senate and then contrast that later with a look at the House of Representatives, which is a much larger body and much more difficult to manage. There are a few key things to remember about Congress. You've got to remember these things if you're going to understand what's going on in those bodies at any given time. First, Congress operates through a very, very strong division of labor principle, and it does this by a committee system. Thus, if Congress needs to work on some matter of, say, for example, foreign policy, it's going to send that work to various agriculture committees. Similarly, if there's a matter of military weapons procurement that needs some attention, it's going to send that to defense committees, and so forth and so on across the entire range of issues. Keep in mind that Congress almost never takes up an issue cold. Instead, it's going to funnel that work through committees of senators and representatives who actually have been on committees for a long time and actually know something about those arenas. Second, keep in mind that the committees themselves are run through a seniority system. And as a result, the people who've been on the committees the longest tend to be the chairs of those committees or otherwise direct the work of those committees. And the third pretty important thing to remember is that the political party with the majority of members in the body controls the agenda of that body and also gets to make committee assignments. And so this is why the Democrats and the Republicans fight so diligently to control the House and the Senate. Another thing to remember is that once a piece of legislation is drafted and submitted to the House or the Senate, the leadership of each chamber will then assign that legislation to one or more of the relevant committees for consideration, or as we say, markup. There's just a tremendous amount of political strategizing going on all the time with regard to draft legislation, which is, of course, a bill. So if a leader wants to fast track some piece of legislation, that can be done by sending it to a committee that favors the bill and wants to work on it urgently. Similarly, a bill can be killed just by sending it to a committee that's hostile to the intent of the legislation. Again, let me make the point that staff members of Congress are very crucial in terms of how all of this works. They largely control the details, not just the daily lives of congressmen, but of the work of all these many congressional committees. It tends to be true that senators and representatives are pulled in lots of different directions, but their ability to survive in the job and function well is really dependent upon the ability of their staff members to be able to ensure that the congressmen spend their time wisely. Now, one of the results of this committee-oriented system is that these committee assignments end up becoming very, very important for individual congresspeople. So one's career as a senator or representative can be made or even broken depending on the committee assignments one ends up getting. So Hamilton himself in the book talks about how badly he wanted to be on budget writing committees. Everybody wants to be on budget writing committees because they get to divvy up money. But instead, he got assigned to the Foreign Affairs Committee when he first came to Congress, and he didn't want to be on that committee. But as he ended up with that assignment and working on that committee, over the course of time, he ended up enjoying it, became kind of a foreign policy expert. And so this committee assignment, which he did not want, took him in a very different direction in terms of his career, different direction than he ever really imagined for himself when he first ran for Congress. Now let me talk a bit about the Senate. As you know, there are 100 members of the Senate. 2 come from each of the 50 states. And it doesn't matter how geographically or demographically large or small the state, they get 2 members of the Senate. Technically, the Vice President of the United States is President of the Senate, but in fact, the Vice President typically stays away, and the body more or less runs itself. The only time the Vice President usually comes around is just every few years if there is a vote that is coming up that is going to be so close that the Vice President might actually need to be there to decide um, on a way to break the deadlock. Now, because of this representation scheme in the Senate, the 26 states with the smallest number of citizens, and you can see here on the slide that the 26 demographically smallest states actually represent less than 18% of the population. But if those 26 states, if their senators get together, they can actually command a majority of votes in the Senate. And so this keeps the heavily populated states from dominating the chamber and forces a kind of spirit of compromise and collegiality on that body, perhaps more than tends to dominate the House. So the work of the committees in the Senate is similar to that of the work of the committees in the House, and this slide has a laundry list of functions, shows a laundry list of functions that committees can actually play. Most committees, however, typically do two things. One is they review and modify proposed legislation, and the other is that they conduct hearings into the implementation of laws and policies pertinent to their purview. There are some committees, though, especially in the Senate, that will look at nominations for presidential appointments and also treaties, and those committees tend to have a little bit more clout. Now, each committee is often broken further into subcommittees or subgroups of these committees. Now, these are much smaller entities, and so subcommittees tend to provide the best opportunities for individual senators or representatives to have influence on the work of a larger committee. So sometimes a senator who's maybe a junior person and can't really have a major appointment in a committee itself can nevertheless run a small subcommittee. You can see here on this slide that the Senate doesn't limit the number of subcommittees that each committee can create, but there are limits on the number of subcommittees that a particular senator can serve on. And since there are only 100 senators in the body, that puts a kind of natural limit on the amount of subcommittees that exist in the chamber. There's no point in having subcommittees if you don't have senators who can serve on them. This next slide is a list of the Senate committees as it's currently organized. And you can see here there's quite a long list of regular or what we call standing committees. And then there's some special committees and some joint committees, which are going to include House members as well. And then down at the bottom right-hand corner of the slide, you can see that there are 68 different subcommittees. So this is a pretty diffuse way of divvying up the 100 members of the Senate, but this is how work gets done in these bodies. So again, most senators have some very specific wants and desires with regard to the committee appointments that they're going to have access to. And also keep in mind that the rule structure and the leadership of the body determine which committees can consider which bills, as well as when bills can finally be brought for consideration by the full chamber. A few more additional points as I'm going through this rapidly. First, for large and very complicated bills, it can often take years for Congress to complete work on legislation. Second, Congress has got to pass identical bills in both the House and the Senate before the President can offer his signature. In terms of where bills come from, there are lots of different places they can originate. Remember, where a bill comes from is really largely irrelevant. I mean, what really matters is that the Senate, the House, and the President all have to agree on the final version of a bill before it can become law. So the legislative process is really about working out the differences across the chambers as well as with the White House. Typically, what happens is that the Senate and the House will actually pass different versions of similar bills on the same subject. And when that happens, there are conference committees that are created that include both House and Senate members, and it's their duty to kind of iron out the differences between the two bills. And assuming that the differences can in fact be reconciled, then each bill is usually passed back to the chamber one more time for final passage, and then those bills are sent to the president. Now, there are a couple of additional features of the Senate that prompt that body to be a bit more bipartisan than the House. The first is the filibuster, which is really the practice of allowing any senator to lead an open-ended discussion of a bill on the floor of the chamber. Since it requires a 3/5 vote of the chamber to overturn a filibuster, what that really means, in essence, is that 60 senators must typically agree on a bill before it can come to the floor for a vote. Just simply the threat of a filibuster is typically enough to keep a bill off the floor or to send it back to the committee for more work. The second thing is the fact that there aren't any real limits on amendments to bills. And as a result, a bill about, let's just say, for example, the price of a bushel of corn could technically be attached to a bill, let's say about funding an interstate highway, even though those two things aren't really related to one another. The fact that there aren't any limits on amendments in the Senate really does help ensure that there's a lot of consensus on a particular bill before it goes to the floor. Since obviously a bill could be quickly killed if the opposition party just starts loading it up with frivolous amendments. And that's sometimes what happens if one party wants to kill a bill because it's not satisfied with it. As I noted earlier, the leadership of the Senate decides collectively about both the agenda and the rules for how the chamber functions. This slide here lists some of the key leadership positions in the Senate. And of course, keep in mind, as I said earlier, that the party that controls the chamber, that party gets to choose the most influential leaders in the body. And let me just reiterate again the importance of the 30,000 or so congressional staff members. They keep the 100 senators and 435 members of the House on task and functioning. So if Congress is successful, that's really not just because of the work of the 535 individual congresspersons, but really due to the staff members who work for that body as well.